Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. It's Cass. Today I want to talk to you about something really cool. I want to talk about dry brushing. Dry brushing is such an awesome technique and I love using it. And I really wanted to make a video on this subject because A, it is so useful and so applicable. And B, there's not much talk about it in its application to alcohol ink, which is a big shame because it is really, really useful with these inks. But I will say at a glance, it appears impossible. Anybody else think that it looks impossible to employ dry brushing techniques with alcohol ink? I remember, I think I even said it in my first video about alcohol ink. I said that I feared that you couldn't make a brush stroke with it. Didn't I say that? Just the term dry brushing in relation to alcohol ink appears to be oxymoronical. That's probably because these inks have such a low surface tension that one tends to feel like there are no degrees of dryness in your brush. Your brush is either dry as a bone or there is ink pooling frantically out of it like a volcano, which is true to an extent. Alcohol ink does have a really low surface tension, so it wants to spread, it wants to run, it wants to bloom. If there is a drop too much of alcohol in your mixture, even just like an ink that is more dilute, I'll give an example, an ink that is pale colored like salmon. Salmon's a very beautiful color, but it's very dilute, it's pale. It's got a high alcohol ratio, a high alcohol to dye ratio in the ink, if you know what I mean. So that's one thing that it can make it seem like, one, it would be impossible to use dry brushing, and two, would be totally irrelevant. But that is not true, and I want to talk about that today. So this is why we need to talk about, right off the hop, before we get started, what do we mean when we say dry brushing? Because that sounds like a really, really general term. And you know what? It is. Dry brushing can be employed in, I will say, any kind of medium that you use a brush to apply. Usually when we use the term dry brushing, I would say 9 times out of 10 we're talking about acrylic painting. However, it is useful in, I would venture to say, every liquid medium that you apply with a brush. If you don't apply with a brush, I don't think you can call it dry brushing. You might call it dry sponging. I don't know, whatever. But the point is, what we mean when we say dry brushing is we essentially just mean that we're working with a paintbrush that is only slightly hydrated with medium. Whether that's acrylic paint, whether that's alcohol ink, whether that's watercolor paint, the effect remains the same. We call it dry brushing when we are only using a slightly hydrated brush to apply pigment or dye, color. So when do we use these techniques? Dry brushing is really, really effective when you want a sketchy look, when you want a brushy look, as it were. When you want to see a nice feathery brush stroke, you can't do that when all of the bristles of your brush are evenly hydrated with color, right? You get a beautiful solid brush stroke, but that's not what you're looking for. You need a brush that's drier, that has less medium in it, that has less hydration in it. Whether you're talking about water or whether you're talking about alcohol, it remains the same. So a lot of times I like to use dry brushing techniques when I'm working on fur, when I'm drawing or painting a subject that has a softer furry quality to it. Alcohol ink with its bloomy texture doesn't really lend itself that well to just painting fur like this. But when you rein in the amount of alcohol in your brush, or in your ink mix and in your brush, then you really increase the possibility of a nice brushy nature. So the exact same ink in your palette that you touch your brush to and your brush is totally hydrated, you can let that ink sit in your palette and dry up just a little bit, because you know that these inks, the alcohol evaporates really, really quickly. So you can put a drop of ink in your palette, let the alcohol evaporate for just a second, test it out on your brush again. If you put your brush in your ink and wipe it off on the edge of your palette, nothing should ever be able to come off. If a drop of color comes off of your brush, it's way too wet for dry brushing. Let your ink evaporate a little bit more. Let your brush dry up a little bit more, and a little bit, we're talking alcohol ink, so seconds, it's not long. That's one of the reasons why this is a fun technique, because you don't have to wait forever. You don't have to wait your whole life for things to dry as they're supposed to. So it's a special technique. I'm going to show you here a couple of different pieces that I use this technique on. I'll show you some acrylic pieces that I used dry brushing in, and I will show some alcohol ink pieces that I used dry brushing. I talked about fur. Here's a really neat one that I did. I was painting a barn owl against a starry sky, and I used a lot of dry brushing in this one, both in the furry downy feathers on the owl's head, and also on the stars behind. So here's what the owl looks like. And you can see all kinds of little soft brushiness in the fur. Well, I don't want to say fur, but it looks like fur. It looked down on the owl's head. And that is really easily achieved when your brush doesn't have a whole lot of medium in it. And I use this for the stars as well. Layering stars on stars on stars on stars. Just a little bit of pigment in my brush. Dab, 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 dab. Dry, 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 dry. Dry on, dry on, dry on, dry on, dry. And you can help really, really achieve a furry, a soft, a hazy effect with these dry brushing techniques. Here's a painting that I used alcohol inks and a dry brushing technique to paint this bee. Now you can see in the fur on the bee that there's a good deal of brushy quality, that there's a good deal of sketchiness, as it were. And that lends to the appearance of fur. Whereas if my brush had been totally loaded with ink, I would have gotten a nice thick swath of color, but it wouldn't have been the sketchy furry look that I'm looking for. Here's another bee that I painted. And this is the painting that we're going to look at with this discussion today.
So here it is, the painting we're going to be looking at today. You can see you can see the bee's abdomen looks nice and furry. And that leads me into my first tip today, which is to couple lifting techniques with dry brushing. Especially if you're painting something like fur or feathers that you want to look fluffy and soft, because if you lift off some of the ink first with anything, a felt pad wet with alcohol, a Q-tip wet with alcohol, I tend to use a paper towel and just fold up a corner, put some alcohol on it, and use that corner to erase, because I can use the same paper towel for eons. But it's as you like, you do you. That's what I find works for me. Now, this particular technique, this lifting off technique, does work great as a base underneath your dry brushing, because it will add to the soft quality. However, this is greatly dependent on the support that you're using, because I'm using narrow paper and it's 100% erasable, so I can erase right back down to white if I want to. I could clean this whole paper off and paint something else on it. If you're using Yupo paper, that's really out the window, because you can lift off a bit, but the paper stains quite badly underneath, and you won't be able to get back to white. But if you're using a narrow paper, or if you're using a tile, I've heard the Duralar synthetic paper is also pretty good for erasability, but I can't vouch for that because I've never tried it. But now you can see that my hand's out of the way and I'm working on the lavender off in the corner. You can see how I've lifted off ink of the bee area. I did not mask my bee at all for this particular exercise. I just drew the bee in pencil on my clean paper, and then flooded the whole paper to make my background and lifted off the areas of the bee that were going to be lighter. chiefly the yellow parts, because the black parts, it doesn't matter what color it has underneath, I'm going to make it black. My next tip is to apply alcohol sparingly from your syringe directly to your paintbrush, not to your palette. When you're using this dry brushing effect with alcohol ink, a wet brush is your worst enemy. So you have to be careful to not use too much. I found that it was easy to solve this problem by just dropping a teeny drip of alcohol from my syringe directly onto my brush and hydrating what's already in my brush. And then I go back and dab it into my palette and see how humid it is. That way, I can see how much ink comes off of the brush, if any. I can wipe it on the edge of my palette and see if a bead comes off, see if my brush is still too wet to dry brush with. If it is, I only have to wait a minute or so, maybe not even, before it dries up enough to work with. So keep testing it, keep wiping it on the side of your palette to see how the humidity is. Because once you reach the golden spot where there's still color in it, but it only just wipes off on the paper instead of pooling out, then you know you're golden. You can start to really lay on some brushy texture. My third tip is to go softly, to use soft, scrubby, brushy strokes. Don't worry about making it too clean. Don't worry about the end of your brush fraying out a little bit. That is just going to add to the softness. Feel free to experiment with just the edges of the brush, the tip of the brush, slightly wet with ink, and brush that across your paper and see what it does. Do you get a nice thick line? Do you get a streaky, sketchy stroke? If you're having a hard time with alcohol dosage when it comes to dry brushing, feel free to really let the ink build up in your palette. And what I mean by that is, if you're having a hard time and you feel like the ink is always too wet, you can't just take a small amount in your brush. That's because the dye is too dilute with alcohol. So put a drip of ink in your palette, let that dry a moment. Put another drip of ink onto the same place and let that dry. Let a small area of color build up and let the alcohol evaporate out of it, so you just have some pure color in your palette. That way you can just drip a drop of alcohol directly onto your brush, go and wet a small amount of the color on your palette where you know that color is ultra concentrated, so you can get a really nice dry look. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining me today. I hope you liked this little chat on dry brushing with alcohol ink. I hope you liked this video. If you did, please give it a like and subscribe to my channel. If you didn't, well, no hard feelings. And I will see you all next time. Or not.